From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, September 8th, 2015. The GOP, Fox News, and cops are banding together to malign Black Lives Matter. We'll hear from Melina Abdullah. And corruption scandals and popular protest in Guatemala have rocked the country. Luisa Rosal of the School of the Americas Watch will join us. Plus, how so-called unicorn companies are inflating a dangerous economic bubble. My guest, Doug Henwood, will explain. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Many thousands of refugees and migrants from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan remain trapped near the Hungarian border with Serbia, but some broke through barriers and police lines today. Given the large media presence, police did not respond violently, although yesterday some clashed with law enforcement. The migrants are being told they have to wait to be registered before being allowed to continue their journey further north, where Germany has promised to take in hundreds of thousands of refugees. After serious pressure from the British public, Prime Minister David Cameron announced his government would take in 10 to 20,000 refugees. French President François Hollande said he would take in 24,000 refugees, and the German Vice Chancellor Sigmar Gabriel said his country would take in 500,000 people a year for several years. But Germany and Sweden have asked the EU to craft policies that would allow for an equitable distribution of the responsibility of refugees. Well, Bob, these generous-sounding quotas will only help those people who survive the dangerous journey to Europe over rickety and unsafe boats crossing the Mediterranean. But what about those people stuck inside Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is a humanitarian crisis on almost unprecedented scale, at least for the last few decades. And whatever measures are taken in Europe aren't going to solve the problem. There are some key questions, of course, about the United States' obligation in this and the U.S. levels of refugee settlement, which are pathetically low. People are starting to raise questions about the wealthy Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Emirates, the people that have the money. Of course, whether Syrians, Iraqis want to go there is another question. But I think, we always come back and should remember that this is a product of U.S. actions, and the United States needs to be accountable, whether that means people coming to the U.S. or U.S. funds. The U.S., at least for us, especially here, should always be at the center of this story.
As the refugee crisis pushes the tyranny of the Islamic State and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to the fore, European nations have now used it as a reason to participate more forcefully in the U.S.-led war on Syria and northern Iraq. Britain announced on Monday that about a month ago it had conducted a drone strike inside Syria that killed 3 people suspected to be aligned with the Islamic State, 2 of them British citizens. Prime Minister Cameron has presented a series of what are being called counter-terrorism measures to the House of Commons that include actively participating in airstrikes on Syria. He's urging the Labour Party to back him, but the party's frontrunner, Jeremy Corbyn, who has been described as Britain's Bernie Sanders, has called for an international summit on Syria before launching airstrikes. French President François Hollande has already begun reconnaissance flights over Syria and is strongly considering airstrikes. But Bob, isn't Western bombing of countries like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, led, of course, by the U.S., a huge part of the problem that generated refugees and strengthened militant groups now?
I think the logic of Cameron and Hollande is impeccable here. The illegal rogue action of Western states over the last decades has caused much of the instability in the Middle East. So to solve the problems generated by that instability, more illegal rogue actions are clearly called for. I mean, it's literally insane. Everyone understands, anyone who cares about human beings understands, that there needs to be a regional solution, and that has to be in an international context. That means Russia and Iran have to be part of this. If you want to talk about settling things in Syria and keeping the Russians and the Iranians out of the process, it's fantasy. There's something called diplomacy. It's not a perfect solution, but it does work, and it works a lot better than drone strikes conducted against your own citizens in extrajudicial assassinations.
And finally, here in the U.S., President Obama marked Labor Day yesterday by signing an executive order that would require employees of federal government contractors to obtain 7 paid sick leave days a year. Obama struck a defiant tone and blasted the Republican Party for speaking to middle-class values while opposing things like paid sick leave. The sick leave policy would not take effect until 2017, after the president's tenure ends. The announcement represents a possible reconciliation between organized labor and the Democratic Party after a rift over the Trans-Pacific Partnership earlier this year. President Obama has already used his executive authority several times to demand higher labor standards of those companies that do business with the government. Well, Bob, on the one hand, it's great that he's pushing so strongly on a basic labor right. On the other hand, he has undermined labor through his determined support of international trade deals that could erode jobs. What do you think of Obama's moves?
Well, there's several things to point out here. One is, remember that the so-called benefits being given here don't even come to the minimal level that's expected in other industrial countries, especially in Western Europe. So we're so far behind that these piecemeal efforts seem like great improvements, but they're still pretty pathetic. The second thing is to remember that the Democratic Party right now operates kind of like moderate Republicans used to decades ago, that these kinds of policies, which would have been widely accepted decades ago, are now seen as Democratic Party politics. The other thing is to remember that ever since the Clinton administration in the 90s, the Democratic Party has essentially abandoned organized labor in the sense of really pushing for labor's agenda to expand union membership instead of let it continue to atrophy. So I'm all for even piecemeal efforts when they improve the lives of ordinary people working, but we shouldn't be overly impressed with Obama or the Democratic Party at this point.
Bob, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin and our daily Newsflash guest expert. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. A comedian has just won the largest number of votes in Guatemala's first election round on Sunday. Jimmy Morales, a well-known television comic, seemingly appeared out of nowhere to garner nearly 24% of the general election votes, beating the two other major candidates, Manuel Baldizon and Sandra Torres. The election turnout was so high it broke records. There is to be a runoff election in October between Morales and whoever is deemed to have had the second highest number of votes. The election comes just days after Guatemala's President Otto Perez Molina resigned in the face of legal charges in a corruption scandal last week. A day after he resigned, Mr. Perez was arrested and spent the night in jail. The Guatemalan Congress has stripped him of immunity, paving the way for the charges. And the scandal involves a customs fraud scheme. Mass protests throughout the country, but especially in Guatemala City, had paved the way for this moment. According to the New York Times, quote, Guatemala City's middle class, long reluctant to speak out after a brutal civil war demonstrated the cost of opposition, joined forces with peasant and indigenous groups. Joining me to attempt to make sense of it all for our U.S. audience here is Maria Luisa Rosal. She's a field organizer for the School of the Americas Watch. Welcome to Uprising, Maria.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Well, before we get to the results of the election, let's start at the corruption probe. What is behind the scandal? What exactly is Mr. Perez being accused of? And I understand it's not just him, but several top political operatives.
So even backing up just a little bit more, the corruption scandal, which was uncovered by the international community to investigate cases of corruption, to dismantle criminal networks. They, in April, uncovered this corruption scandal at the tune of $3 million in bribes to officials in exchange for reduced tariffs in the customs. And this report that came out of the CC implicates actually 158 people in office, 38 who have since been jailed, including the former Vice President Roxana Valdetti. And this is happening in the context of once this corruption scheme is sort of uncovered, many people begin to take to the streets and have sustained a presence in the streets since April.
So basically, businesses that wanted to avoid paying customs at the border, bringing imported materials, were able to avoid paying those taxes, tariffs, by bribing officials. That's essentially what the scandal is suggesting had happened.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. And really, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's well known that in Guatemala, there is an institutional corruption that exists and has even become more profound since the signing of the peace accords in 1996.
So let's talk about what happened last week. This is how the New York Times described it. Quote, for much of Guatemala's violent history, marked by dictatorship and military repression, such a scene would have been unimaginable. A president forced to resign, then sit in an open court to hear charges leveled against him, and ultimately spend the night in prison, in a prison he once might have overseen as a top general, all that in the course of a single day. Do you agree with the Times about how unprecedented this situation was that unfolded last week?
I believe so, and really, it's important to highlight the mobilizations by the people in this. You have to understand it in the context of rampant impunity in Guatemala. And Guatemala, even though the internal armed conflict ended in 1996, it was a conflict that lasted for 36 years, with everything that that implies, where you saw the worst human rights atrocities committed in the region, backed by and fully really well documented by a UN Truth Commission report that was published in 1999.
So let's talk about who Mr. Perez is and what his background is, what he really represents, particularly for our U.S. audience, what he represents throughout Latin America, where we have had leaders influenced and educated by a sort of American way of doing things, U.S. American.
Otto Perez Molina actually has a very long-standing history with the United States, over 30 years, in fact. He kind of rises to power in many different ways throughout history. He is a School of the Americas graduate. The organization that I work for, School of the Americas Watch, principally founded to close the school. It's a military training school that was founded in 1946 in the Panama Canal Zone and later moves to the United States and exists now at Fort Benning. It's now been renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. This school has been principally linked with some of the worst human rights violations in the region, training Latin American soldiers and police. And when they go back to their country, they have been linked with some of the most heinous human rights violations, including the worst massacres, especially in El Salvador, the murder of Archbishop Romero, among others. This school has produced 11 dictators, just to name a few of the atrocities. And Otto Perez Molina, this is the school he's coming from. And in 1982, during the worst intensification of the internal armed conflict in Guatemala, under another School of the Americas graduate, General Dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, he oversaw the scorched earth campaigns, which were essentially massacres, razing villages en masse in the highlands of Guatemala, principally in Quiché. And this is well documented. You can now find this all in U.S. declassified documents, and like I mentioned before, outlined in UN Truth Commission reports, the level of human rights abuses. And there's even a 1994 Defense Intelligence Agency cable mentioning U.S. knowledge of Otto Perez Molina's leadership within the ranks of the military. Kind of, he's rising up within these ranks. Also a graduate of the Caibil School, which was one of the worst elite squads in Guatemala that committed heinous human rights abuses as well. And stating that Otto Perez Molina was part of this group of officers that were progressives with blood on their hands. And so what they meant here was, by the time the peace accords were signed, there was sort of a division within the army, and Otto Perez Molina was part of that negotiating process. And so they know of his involvement, the United States. In fact, the United States, as I mentioned before, trained him and still saw him as their best hope despite the involvement that he's had in the worst period of the internal armed conflict. In 2013, the former dictator, General Efraín Ríos Montt, was found guilty for genocide and crimes against humanity, specifically during this period, even though the sentence was overturned.
Now, Reuters reported last week, Maria, that with an exclusive saying that it was actually the U.S. that had pressured Mr. Perez to back the investigation into the corruption scandal that led him to where he is now. Apparently, U.S. Ambassador Todd Robinson met with Perez and urged him to slowly start purging his government of people accused of corruption in exchange for aid money from the United States. I mean, it certainly sounds like the U.S. meddling in Guatemala's affairs, but this time meddling in line with what ordinary Guatemalans wanted and opposition to what long-standing U.S. policy had been if it was U.S. policy that had elevated Mr. Perez.
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little tricky. He was pressured by the United States, as you say, and in fact, he was very reluctant to allow the CICIG to extend their mandate for 2 more years in the country. He was very set on getting them out, and the United States pressure was to renew the mandate. There was intense pressure to do this, and so it was renewed. And soon after is when this corruption scandal unfolded. And to kind of speak to the thoughts on why this would be, what would the United States be asking, immediately after the resignation of former Vice President Roxana Valdetti, the State Department that same day on May 8th issued a statement noting that this was an important step to address corruption. And which was for them, for the United States, through the State Department statement, it was a central point in moving forward with what's known as the Alliance for Prosperity. It's a billion-dollar package for regional security and investment initiatives in not only Guatemala, but the rest of the northern region of Central America, which would include El Salvador and Honduras. And so all this to say that it seems that the demands of the people right now are also in line with the interests of the United States in promoting this security, regional security initiative, which is really an extension of the Central American Regional Security Initiative, CARSI.
Now, Maria Luisa, let's talk about who Jimmy Morales is and what he represents. In the first round of elections on Sunday, his name hadn't very much, he's well known inside Guatemala for being a television comedian, but polls were not showing him having much widespread support. Over 70% of Guatemalans came out to vote, and he garnered the largest block, 24%. So he heads to a runoff election in October with either of the 2 other people who garnered votes, Manuel Balizon or Sandra Torres. It hasn't been determined yet who got the second number of votes. Who is Jimmy Morales, and what does his garnering of so many votes represents?
So yeah, Jimmy Morales, he's quite young. He's 46. He is a comedian. He And to preface the whole electoral climate, this is in the context of this corruption scandal in the middle of all these mass protests. And a lot of people think that a lot of the 24% of votes that went to him were really a vote against the corruption. Mm-hmm. And even though he ran on almost like an anti-politician platform, he's very new to the political arena, distancing himself from what's been happening with the corruption. He is backed by the weight and pressure and power for everything that means of the military, from the old guard of the military. The political party is very much supported by the most right-wing part of the armed forces in Guatemala. And so this is very concerning for many people, especially within the human rights community.
Now, let's talk about what is next for Guatemala with this particular corruption scandal, and also what's playing out on the streets. If the protests on the streets had really pushed or given impetus to the legal system to charge and arrest and jail many of these top politicians like Mr. Perez, what is next? What do you hope for next in Guatemala? And, can the judicial system clean up the corruption?
Yeah, well, Guatemala still remains, despite the victory, and it should be seen as a victory for the people and for rule of law in Guatemala. Otto Perez Molina's resignation, and in fact, he's in a hearing today, this morning, to see if he will in fact go on trial. It should be seen as a victory. What will happen? Guatemala is still a country where anything is possible. I would say the key takeaways from what's happening right now, there's still much more to come. The future really is uncertain. People do want to maintain a presence in the streets, even though, yes, as you say, the voter turnout was huge. Numbers hadn't been seen like that since the 1986 elections. Still important to say that there was 30% abstention. And people would like to stay mobilized and holding leaders to account for the corruption. There have been one of the banners that was held during one of the many mobilizations that I really keep in mind is one that said, "They took away so much from us that they ended up taking the fear away from us." And that's really important in a country that's been marked by impunity, not just impunity and corruption now, but the impunity for all the crimes against humanity that were committed. Again, Guatemala lived one of the worst armed conflicts in the region, specifically during the 1980s, at the tune of 200,000 dead, 50,000 disappeared, including 5,000 children that were disappeared, scorched earth campaigns, all under the national security doctrine with the full backing of the United States. So there's also much to say about the responsibility that the United States has to bear in this. And interestingly, unlike the May 8th resignation of Vice President Roxana Valdetti, where the State Department issued a statement, the State Department has not issued any statement on Otto Perez Molina to this point right now. So that's also telling of sort of where the United States lies in all of this.
And I want to ask you about the protests on the streets of Guatemala, because these days when there are mass mobilizations, sadly, we have to have some skepticism as well. If we look at countries like Venezuela, where mass protests have been used by the right to justify the tearing down of leadership. But in Guatemala's case, how sincere are the protests? There are middle-class residents who have joined forces with indigenous and poor Guatemalans. Is this a legitimate, sincerely grassroots movement?
That's still, I believe so. And what you see now are groups that have never been active on the streets as they were during the 1980s, 1970s even, that yes, the students are mobilizing, and you're seeing really a mobilization of all sectors of society. Like I said, people that have never been out on the streets to protest, and what they're tired of and what unifies the movement is they're tired of corruption. Right. It will be interesting to see, and I believe that Guatemala has taken many strides in trying to reconstruct the historical memory, and they haven't forgotten the crimes of the past. And so while yes, Otto Perez Molina is being put hopefully on trial for corruption, they might be able to put him on trial for crimes against humanity, as they have no statute of limitations as well. And so it's still unclear. It remains to be seen what will happen. But what is clear is people are very tired of the corruption.
Thank you so much, Maria Luisa Rosal, field organizer for School of the Americas Watch, which you can find out more online about at soaw.org. There's going to be a national convening November 20th through the 22nd at Fort Benning in Georgia to urge shutting down of the renamed School of the Americas. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Maria Luisa Rosal, again, is the field organizer for the School of the Americas Watch, soaw.org. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. In the wake of 2 police killings in Houston and Chicago, law enforcement has suddenly decided it's all the fault of Black Lives Matter. They're echoing what Fox News and shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly have been saying. O'Reilly in particular has been taking aim at the movement multiple times during his shows, saying things like, every time there's a controversy about an officer shooting a black person, they're out there stirring the pot. Various hosts have called BLM a murder movement and even a hate group. Meanwhile, presidential candidates like Senator Ted Cruz and former Governor Scott Walker have also jumped on the bandwagon, tying Black Lives Matter to what they call an anti-police culture that they also blame President Obama for. Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee said that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would be, quote, appalled at the movement's focus on race. To its credit, the New York Times editorial board penned an op-ed last week responding to these sentiments, saying, quote, this argument betrays a disturbing indifference to, or at best, a profound ignorance of history in general, and of the civil rights movement in particular. Joining me in studio today is Melina Abdullah. She's a professor and a chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA and an major organizer with Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. Welcome to Uprising, Melina.
Thank you for having me, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, we've had conversations now over several months, and I really appreciated sort of your analysis on national but also local level. Let's first talk about how new these attacks against Black Lives Matter are. Has the right been maligning the movement from the start, or are you sort of noticing a new level of attacks? Because it's always useful for conservatives to bash movements, particularly led by people of color, while they're campaigning for an election because it helps them appease their voter base.
Absolutely. The right never liked us, and it was never really our job to get the right to like us, right? So really what the movement is about is dismantling a system that oppresses us, and the right is invested in that system. Now, what we're seeing happen over the recent weeks is kind of a ramping up of the way in which they attack Black Lives Matter. And kind of the viciousness of the attacks. However, we also need to recognize that those are rooted in the history of any Black liberation movement. So I think the New York Times piece did a really good job at kind of reframing the civil rights movement. And if we were to go deeper, we could think about the way in which Martin Luther King, who Mike Huckabee had the audacity to invoke, right, was attacked by the same right wing that's attacking us. And so this is part of the history of Black liberation struggles.
Right. The civil rights movement was not popular among the right when it was happening. It's only in hindsight that now, of course, it's not the done thing to criticize the civil rights movement.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the majority of America was not behind the civil rights movement when it was happening. That's why it was a struggle, and that's why Dr. King talks about the beautiful struggle, and that's why he was in prison so many times, and that's why, we had to constantly, or civil rights movement organizers had to constantly butt up against state power. We have to recognize anytime we're working towards transformation, trying to fundamentally change systems, it's not an easy road, and we're going to really be pushing against the tide.
Let's talk about what some cops are saying. Thousands of people turned out to the funeral of the slain police officer in Houston, Texas last week. And when Officer Goforth was killed, Harris County Sheriff Ron Hickman made a wild speculation. He said, we've heard Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Well, cops' lives matter too. So how about we drop the qualifier and just say lives matter? Then he went on Fox News and said, you can't help but wonder if there are people who are susceptible to the message that someone should lash out and make targets of police officers. You can't help but wonder. What do you make of these speculations? He said a lot more other things.
Right, I know, I've heard it. I mean, I think it's just an absolutely ridiculous accusation, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but I do want to say that, what he signals is this investment in a policing model that oppresses Black folks, right? And he's not willing to really examine the reason that we say Black Lives Matter. We say Black Lives Matter because Black lives are constantly under attack by the police state. And so we have to lift that up. We'd be really kind of shirking our responsibility as engaged public to not address the way in which Black people are systematically oppressed by this current policing system. And so that doesn't mean that we're against individual police. It doesn't mean that we're condoning violence. Anyone who's been to a Black Lives Matter demonstration or action knows it's full of love, and that's really the space that we're coming from, a space of Black Black love, and really kind of trying to surround and protect and support and liberate our people.
Well, what was said last week was similar to the things that came up last December in New York when there were 2 police officers that were killed, and the police union spokesperson was very upset. And it's interesting, if you actually look at how many cops have been killed, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, which keeps careful track of police officers who are killed, according to their statistics, the number of cops that have been killed by firearms has actually gone down over the past year. And the single largest thing that kills police officers is traffic accidents.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, the number of people that police have killed has gone up.
Right. Policing, is not even in the top 10 most dangerous jobs. It's more dangerous to be a meat packer than a police officer. That said, it's really important that we really kind of, again, examine the way in which police are policing. And it's time for us to, I think what this signals is it's time for us to reimagine public safety and think about what creates safer conditions for communities. And so a reinvestment in things like intervention programs, community work, even being radical enough to say, well, maybe we need to disarm police, are all things that we need to kind of be examining and pushing forward. What they're trying to do is really distract us from that kind of focus. And so we really need to, again, lift up those statistics that you gave, that we're down 17% in police killings, right? That police continue to kill Black people with impunity right here in Los Angeles. We just had the police kill a Black woman, mother of 2, Riddell Jones, and there's been not even a conversation about that murder. The murderers of Ezell Ford in Los Angeles are still on the force, still being paid, and there's no conversation about how to kind of re-examine the way in which policing our neighborhoods.
Well, what's very dangerous about this kind of rhetoric from the police is that it also then emboldens vigilantism. And there was this horrific Facebook video last week that went briefly viral by an East Texas man named Nathan Enner. He was this large man with a cowboy hat and a southern drawl who basically threatened to kill people from Black Lives Matter. He kept referring to, quote, black thugs, warned the police to not step in between people like him with shotguns, and black groups that come to your town, presumably with their weapons. He said, our fight to cops, he said, our fight is not with you, it's for you. He's basically threatening to kill Black people and members of Black Lives Matter on behalf of police.
And unfortunately, that kind of violence is not a rarity. So if you look at the comments sections, every time we come on shows like this, there are people who say things like, I just got a phone call from someone who identified himself as Darren Wilson and said, I better be careful before I end up like Mike Brown. So
wow, you just got a death threat?
Yeah, well, all of us get them constantly. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about, when we talk about responsibility, what the right wing is doing to kind of whip up that kind of vigilantism. And they are engaging in a process that they know is very dangerous for us. And so those kinds of things need to be checked. When someone like Trump says, if we disrupt him, he's going to beat us up, right? Think about the kinds of things that he's doing, what he's doing on the other side to whip up folks who may not be, mentally stable. Right.
And so when we talk about who's killing whom and who's threatening to kill whom, it's pretty clear why there is such a slogan as Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's talk about what police are actually doing to Black Lives Matter, even as they're blaming the movement for killing them. Last week, the Pasadena chapter founder of Black Lives Matter, Jasmine Richards, who's been a guest on Uprising a couple of times, was arrested for the second time. She was just released. She's being charged with a number of things. It was a complicated situation in Pasadena, but she is facing 2 sets of charges. And it seems as though the police want to put her away for a long time. How important is Jasmine's case? Is it clear to you that she's being targeted for her activism?
Oh, absolutely. This is the second targeted arrest. Both of the arrests came after major actions in Pasadena. Jasmine's case really represents the way in which we're feared by the state, because Jasmine represents a group of folks who are not meant to be activists in the eyes of the state, right? So Jasmine has a history where she actually turned her life around and became an activist about a year ago. And so they're fearful of that. What she's been able to do is pull people off of the corners, get them to really engage in activism work, get them to really analyze the situations that put them in a place of kind of constant uncertainty, right? No jobs, no resources, that sort of thing, and say this is kind of the state structuring itself this way. And so we should rise up and we should engage. And so the targeting of Jasmine Richards is, I think, emblematic of the state's fear of Black working class folks and regular Black folks really engaging in movement building.
And it's interesting, you're an academic, and Black Lives Matter is very diverse. And it's interesting that within this grouping that they seem to have targeted, one of the people who is extremely young. As you said, working class roots, herself as somebody suddenly seeing herself very empowered, and is somebody who's inspiring other people like her in her community and neighborhood to stand up. How, in the past, police don't have the same reputation for brutality as other departments do nationally. People in the community would probably disagree. What sort of action can people in the community take to support somebody like Jasmine? Because what's happening when you have a case like hers is, all of a sudden, she has to worry about where to get the money to fight back against all of these charges, and it encumbers her effectiveness as an activist.
Right, and it encumbers the entire movement, because then we have to kind of focus on getting Jasmine released, right, and making sure Jasmine, let me be sure that I underscore, Jasmine was arrested, but so were 10 other folks in Pasadena. So the entire
including
chapter,
an 11-year-old boy?
Including an 11-year-old boy and 7 other minors, all under the age of 16. And so there's this fear. Pasadena is a kind of smallish town. I would equate it to the Los Angeles version of Ferguson, right? It's a small town, and it's a relationship. There's a relationship to Los Angeles, but it's not Los Angeles. And so the way in which policing is done in Pasadena is really, really repressive. And there's an entire report that the police unions have gone through great lengths to make sure it doesn't get released to the public, right? Which really indicts the entire police department and says that it's not just that the activism in Pasadena began around the killing of Kendrick McDade in Pasadena, right? But it wasn't just the killing of Kendrick McDade that this report found to be problematic. It's also the way in which policing is done in Pasadena. And so that department is really, really repressive and reminds me a lot of small town kind of southern bands of supposed law enforcement that are really criminal in their behaviors.
Well, there was just an article on Real Clear Politics, which also kind of, to me, marks the dangerous tone of the rhetoric now around Black Lives Matter in the mainstream. This particular article by Michael Barone was entitled, "Black Lives Matter Agenda is Costing Black Lives." Among the things he said is one of BLM's demands is to end broken windows policing. The evidence, according to this author, is that this is already happening at the cost of Black lives. Even the New York Times has noticed so far this year, murders are up 76% in Milwaukee, 60% in St. Louis, 56% in Baltimore, and 44% in Washington, D.C. It's interesting that this writer is equating the homicide rates rising to BLM's call for ending broken windows policing. How do you respond?
Well, first of all, the call to end broken windows policing is something that we support, but I think he's actually drawing from Campaign Zero's request, which is, we collaborate with them, but that's not right. So it's really important that we understand that. However, we do agree we should end broken windows policing. What he's not addressing is what it is we're asking for. And so if we look at statistics in Los Angeles, right, we know that when we move money away from armed police who occupy Black neighborhoods to intervention workers, that actually is a much, much more effective form of reducing violence and crime in our communities. And so we know that over the last 10 years in Los Angeles, the funding for intervention workers, for instance, has remained stagnant while they've more than doubled the money that they're spending on policing in those same neighborhoods. And so there's this kind of refusal to look at data that really bolsters what we're saying. We are not saying we don't want safe communities. We're saying we do want safe communities, but we also know the way in which we create them. We know that the creation of safe communities is investment in community programs. We know it's livable wage jobs. We know that more than 90% of crimes, when we track the data, is related to two things: lack of mental health resources. And so even if we go back and circle back to the Texas example, right? You know, it's amazing to me that they're faulting Black Lives Matter and not really examining a system that didn't provide any resource for the man who had been deemed unfit to stand trial because of his mental health issues, right? And so lack of mental health resources is a huge challenge, as are economic conditions. So livable wage jobs. In Los Angeles, we have a 52% unemployment or underemployment rate within the Black community. When you begin to fix those kinds of things, we begin to live in safer communities. And we've seen it work in cities like Newark, which is where I'm traveling to today, actually, where Raz Baraka, the mayor of Newark, is really looking into these kinds of big picture shifts. And so the idea that broken windows policing is the problem really neglects the data and really neglects the truth of what creates safer communities.
Finally, Melina, Mother Jones published this interesting piece called "Here's the Conservative Playbook for Tearing Down Black Lives Matter." In it, they laid out how the same tactics that were used to discredit and criminalize the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movements of the past, and even the Civil Rights Movement are being employed to bring down BLM. Do you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we see it all. We see the targeting of activists. We see all kinds of things happening that really mirror. We see tracking. We see our data being surveilled constantly. And so those are all reminiscent of both the Civil Rights Movement, how they toppled or attempted to topple the Civil Rights Movement, as well as the Black Power movement.
Melina, I want to thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And is there a website for Black Lives Matter LA? Facebook page?
They can follow us on Black Lives Matter Los Angeles Facebook page or on Twitter at BLMLA, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles.
We'll post links to uprisingwithsonali.com later today. Thank you so much, Melina. My guest, Melina Abdullah, is a professor and chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA and a major organizer with Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. Every now and then the story of an enormously successful tech company being worth hundreds of millions of dollars or even $1 billion makes the news. And these stories are a hallmark of our new technology-buoyed economy. So magical and highly valued are such companies that insiders have a name for them: unicorns. Only about 100 such companies exist worldwide, and a majority of them are in the U.S. But as with any such too-good-to-be-true financial phenomenon, is the warning of what happened last time and what is likely to happen in the future. What goes up must come down, or perhaps what inflates into a bubble must eventually burst. That's the case my guest Doug Henwood makes in his new article for The Nation, entitled Age of the Unicorn: How the Fed Tried to Fix the Recession and Created the Tech Bubble. Doug Henwood is a political economist, author of After the New Economy, editor of Left Business Observer. Welcome to Uprising, Doug. Thanks for joining us. Well, just to get a sense of what companies are considered unicorns, you cite the famous ones that were unicorns before they were famous: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Groupon, etc. What is the financial definition of a unicorn?
It's a company that's worth $1 billion. And the way that's figured is if, say, an investor puts $100 million into a company and gets a 10% stake in it, that's figured to be $1 billion. We don't really know that they could actually sell the other 90% for 900 million, but that's the rule of thumb that people use. It's just a way of being gee whiz when you have a unicorn.
So aren't these so-called unicorns artificially inflating the economy? And what does the Federal Reserve have to do with it?
Well, the Federal Reserve, starting after the financial crisis, when interest rates got down to 0% and the economy was not taking off, decided to do something called quantitative easing, which meant basically they bought gobs of bonds, treasury bonds and mortgage bonds, in a hope to get some liquidity into the economy and stimulate things. Most people who study this think that it helped a little bit, but not very much. Maybe added a couple of percentage points to economic growth over the last few years, maybe took a fraction of a percent off the unemployment rate. So, but when fiscal problems when fiscal policy has been very tight, this was the only stimulative game in town. But one thing it did was certainly to stimulate the financial markets. The Fed pumped over $4 trillion of liquidity into the markets, and that led to a very buoyant stock market, at least the last couple of months, to buoyant real estate markets in cities where finance is big, like on the coast, New York and in California, but also did also stimulate investment by venture capitalists in tech startups. And this, unlike the boom in the late 90s, doesn't involve the public so much. In the late 90s, the public bought all these crazy dot-com stocks, and when everything went bust, millions of people lost lots of money. So their retirement accounts wiped out or their savings really, really reduced. This time, it's mostly institutional investors who put money into venture capital funds. So when things go bust, the immediate circle of people that's going to be hurt will be relatively small, although this money has really inflated real estate markets in New York and especially San Francisco. That's, I think, the real world effect of a lot of this has been to do that, to price people out of those areas.
I want to quote from your article, Doug, about just how artificial these tech companies' products are and their promise of profits are. You wrote, quote, on June 1st, it was revealed that Snapchat, a company that made its name on Evanescence, raised over $500 million, bringing its valuation to $16 billion. As of now, it has almost no revenue and nothing but red ink where the profits should be, but its long-term plan seems to amount to hopes to sell advertising someday. That's crazy.
Yes, well, there's a lot of that, and it reminds me so much of the late 90s dot-com bubble. When I interviewed a guy who ran a mutual fund that invested in dot-com stocks, he said, it's good not to have earnings. And I said, okay, sure. And of course, that all went bust. And now we're hearing some similar stories that these companies will, make tons of money in the future, but they're not yet. Even Uber, which is a big deal, is not making money or is barely making any money. It's hard to tell because it's a privately held company. But I quote somebody in the article who said that Uber is going to have to grow by some phenomenal percentage rate for years and years and years to justify the valuations being accorded to it now. And that's, relatively speaking, in this world, a solid company. Now, Facebook is making money. Facebook is, but it's very well established. But most of these other guys aren't making any money and really don't have a prayer of making money. I don't quite understand how they hope to make money. Spotify, also well established, a unicorn, but not likely to make any money that anyone can see in the near future. Doug,
wasn't that Amazon's profit model as well, that for years Amazon didn't make any money because they were essentially underselling everybody and promising the moon? But of course now Amazon is Amazon.
Well, Amazon is still a giant, but it's not making lots of money. It's barely profitable. Conventional measures. Yeah, the whole idea is to build market share and drive everyone else out of business, and then I guess they'll be sitting pretty. But they haven't gotten there yet. It's more than 15 years into the history of Amazon. They're still barely making any money. It's a weird model of capitalism. This in a system where everything is supposed to be organized around making profit, Sometimes in bubbles moments, that requirement is suspended, and people believe in the future and to talk all these marvelous, almost utopian tales. But then it all comes crashing back down.
And I want
Well,
to
someday soon, I'm sure.
I want to talk about that crash, but the coming crash. But who is pouring money into these tech companies, because they do need startup money? And I'm thinking of all the worthy and important projects that could actually benefit humanity, that actually make things that help people or enable people to be helped, that are constantly starving for funds, KPFK included. And
Yes.
there are these rich people clearly with billions to throw around. They're investing in these tech companies that may crash and burn and someday crash the economy, but they'll still have a few million left or several million left to live out their lives, even if they lose their few billion. And the rest of us may have pensions that are invested in these artificial companies.
Yeah, well, it's venture capitalists are the ones who put most of the money into these things. Venture capitalists, most of the industry is clustered around Sand Hill Road in Palo Alto. It's a small group of people who know each other basically, and eat at the same places and go to the same parties, and they raise their money from institutional investors like pension funds, some rich individuals, but mostly it's big institutional investors like pension funds. And then they look for major opportunities. Now, the way the venture capital industry works is that you assume that maybe 9 out of 10 of your investments are going to go bad, but number 10 will hit it big, and that's why you make all your money. But every now and then they get really, really carried away with the crazy stuff. And, that happened a little over 15 years ago, and it's happening again now. And you can just look back, you can look at it and say, what are these people thinking? A mattress company, maker of razor blades. I mean, these are the kinds of things that supposedly magical, that are going to transform the world, that it's really hard to believe the story. When this happened in the late 90s, they were building the commercial internet. So, it's some of that stuff, although it appeared crazy, at least there was a real world consequence, a positive real world consequence to some of it. Now I just can't see it at all, and something like Uber does damage to cab drivers. Something like Airbnb is raising rents in expensive cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York. The positive benefit, a lot of this stuff is really hard to see this time around, but so I guess the venture capitalists are hoping that one of them is going to hit it big, but I think a lot of them are going to lose a lot of money.
And so what happens when they lose a lot of money, and how likely is it that this is a tech bubble that will burst? Because clearly these, mainstream economists aren't really talking about it. They don't really see it, but then they usually don't see the bubbles before they burst.
Yeah, a lot of economists believe financial markets are rational, so there can't possibly be bubbles, which is
even though history completely tells us otherwise.
Yes, yes, yes. But history is not for the textbooks. It's going to burst eventually somehow. The Federal Reserve is planning on raising interest rates, if not in a couple of weeks, then probably later this year. The troubles we saw in the Chinese stock market and the Chinese economy as it's slowing down suggest that maybe we're on somewhere nearer the bursting of that bubble than we were before. Speculative markets hate it when the central bank starts tightening and raising interest rates. And the speculative markets love it when the central bank is being really loose and pumping money into the system. And it had been pumping money like crazy into the system, which is what fed this, what inflated this bubble. And now as the Fed starts trying to withdraw some of this liquidity, I think we'll see that bubble begin bursting probably later this year.
Later this year, that's fast.
Well, it's been going for a couple of years. I mean, it's been, the number of, what was the number of unicorns? I can't remember these numbers exactly, but like something, there were 8 unicorns in the early 2000s, and now we've got, over 100 of them, depending upon who's doing the counting.
Right.
Most of them born during the last 2 years.
And for anybody just tuning in, by unicorn, we're talking about a startup tech company worth at least $1 billion. And now on Friday, the Labor Department released its monthly jobs report. It found that the economy added 173,000 jobs and that the unemployment level fell to a low 5.1%. The New York Times said that the report, quote, provided evidence for both camps to make their cases. This is both camps in the debate over whether the Fed should raise interest rates. What do you think based on this jobs report?
Well, part of the problem is that those numbers come from separate surveys. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does a survey of households that comes up with the unemployment rate, asks people, are you working, not working, what what kind of work do you do? But they also survey employers. So they survey about 300,000 employers to come up with that number. And so that 173,000 number comes from the survey of employers. It was weaker than it's been in the previous 6 months or so, considerably weaker than it was in the 6 months before that, and was below what most people who follow these things were expecting. So that could be taken as a sign that the economy is slowing down. It could also just be an anomalous month. We won't really know till next month. But the household survey shows, a decline in unemployment. Decline in the number of unemployed, decline in the unemployment rate, which makes people who are nervous about inflation, which is crazy right now, but there are people on Wall Street who are nervous about inflation. That makes them very nervous. They don't like to see the unemployment rate get too low, so they're pressing the Fed to tighten. The Fed has been ambiguous about what it's planning to do in its next policy meeting in a week or two. So we shall see, but I don't think they'll be very aggressive in tightening, but the markets have gotten so addicted to easy money for years now that breaking of that habit could be pretty disruptive, as they like to say in Silicon Valley.
Finally, in the last few seconds, Doug, what can we do, those of us who don't have money invested in these massive tech companies called unicorns? Will we be hurt when this bubble bursts?
Well, I don't think it will hurt too many people who are not directly involved in this game.
Right, so it's different from the last tech bubble, as
Yeah,
you
it's
were
very
saying.
different from last time when people had lots of money invested. People had their retirement money invested. If you have money in a pension, most people don't have pensions anymore. But if you do, if you're lucky enough to have a pension, you may take a very, very slight hit. But I don't think it's going to affect too many people in the real world, unless you're like driving a car for Uber. And there could be a positive effect in that, as I was saying earlier, the pressures on housing costs in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York could ease up some, because this bubble has been driving the rents higher. And
So the ripple effect of an inflating bubble might tamp down.
Yeah.
Well, Doug,
Unless people panic, and then if people panic, then who knows what will happen. But if people don't panic, it shouldn't matter too much to regular people.
we'll post a link to your article from our website later today. Doug, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Doug Henwood is a political economist, author of After the New Economy, the editor of Left Business Observer. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Teddy Robinson is our audio engineer. Special thanks to Kiana Turner, our visual editor, and Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.